Okay, in this video we're going to be going over why Yaron Brook's take on foreign policy is wrong. He's from the Ayn Rand Institute. Basically, we're going to go over what his points are and why they're wrong. Basically, his points are that they end up going on the idea of that he thinks that you can fight radical Islam overseas with it, but not necessarily go into exporting democracy, and that it ends up going into the idea of protecting the nation state, but uh, and then that it is actually in the nation's interest to actually protect a nation like Israel in the Middle East. Now, this is actually something that is very, very inconsistent with going in, frankly, any type of thing with virtually with individualism first, but I can actually go over with why it's inconsistent with actually any type of form of foreign policy perspective. Basically, for the foreign policy perspectives you're going to find out there are basically you're going to find the realist perspective, you're going to find the liberal perspective, and the identity perspective out there. Identity perspective is basically something in which you're saying that nations are controlled by ideas. The realist perspective is basically nations are fine as long as they do not radically change their functions of government. And the liberal perspective is basically this is where you go in and you try to make them into an ideal utopia. Now, frankly, when we start to look at this, we can see that his ideas do not fit into it. Even if we go into the more rare ones, such as the Marxist identity, Marxist perspectives, or the feminist perspective, it still does not fit into this because they end up going to the ideas of stating that you only would intervene is if multinational corporations end up going through and they end up subjugating these people to taking their resources in their country. And that still does not even fit to those points. His points are basically meaning that he views them in a what it called in an uncultured way, and that they are a threat to Western values. And that still does not, if you view individualism and that everybody has a right to their own moral choices, this would essentially mean that you cannot assert your values over someone else's, regardless of this. Now, obviously, there's what it called. You can hold the ideas of that there is not moral relativism, but the fact is you still cannot, even if you do hold the idea that moral relativism does not exist, you can use this in an idea that when you're dealing with such things as human rights, when you're talking about human rights abuses, but you still cannot do. You still do not have the right to intervene in another country's affairs. You can actually rescue people from horrible situations in humanitarian rescue efforts, but this is the limitations of what you can actually do. You cannot actually commit forcible violence on someone else, and you need to actually to look at individualism. You need to actually look at the actual military, our actual military itself. Does this would essentially violate what they've done. Their essential thing with it, with our military, is they did not sign up to actually go after in search of other enemies across the globe. They merely went to protect the nation, it's the United States nation itself, and to protect the rights of the people themselves. It was not to go off and fight other people across the globe. And when we start to view this, you can actually see that it violates their rights as well as individuals, because they're not there just to serve this obscure viewpoint that does not fit any type of foreign policy perspective that doesn't even exist. And I know Yaron Brook is from Israel, so he's probably going to have this specific type of viewpoint. He's originally from Israel, I should say. And he's going to have this specific viewpoint as well. So that's going to obviously color it in a specific ways. And that is one of the things that's going to distort it. And why he's going to state that the U.S. has an interest in protecting him. But what we need to do is we need to go back how the Middle East was actually set up and in its modern form. Now, the way usual nation states actually are formed is usually a group of people enter a piece of land and they actually form an actual state. And it's actually without any intervention outside that area. But the way the Middle East was formed is in each of the cases is it was intervention from outside those sources. Israel was actually only formed from actually anti-Semitism from the United Kingdom. They wanted a way to get rid of Eastern European Jewish immigrants from the United Kingdom. They wanted to get rid of these people. They wanted to throw them out. And the best way to do it was essentially seen right after World War I. And this was essentially seen in that Treaty of Versailles. Basically, that was part of it. They worked with France to carve up the Middle East. One of the carve-ups was creating the state of Israel. This is one of the early creations of that state. And this was essentially kick Palestinians out of their land and basically create a dumping ground for all the undesirables in their country. And that was basically their solution. We saw this with them starting with, that's how Jordan was created. Jordan is not a real land. Jordan was actually part of it was actually Palestine. The other part was actually part of Persia. And this was carved up. You also saw Syria and Iran were one nation. That was Persia. That's why when they say, why is Syria so close to Iran? Well, it was the same country. You also had Iraq was actually Kurdistan. So that was essentially another one that was created out of thin air. You have all these nations, you basically going before with it during, I believe it was like 500 AD, you had Libya was created out of thin air with it because the Italians took it over. And then once they left with it, you're left with basically a bunch of tribal areas. They were essentially eventually under a long string of strongmen. So then when you killed off the last strongman, you essentially were left with a horrible situation. And this is what happens when you do that. And this is essentially what happens in the Middle East. It's been carved up for generations. And basically this idea that we can actually go in there and actually do anything. And another thing is when we view this idea of getting rid of basically Islamic extremism, let's limit to basically Sunni Salafi groups. Now, these aren't just limited to basically one area around the world. He doesn't have I don't believe he has a background in history at all with it, so he wouldn't understand that this is not just limited to the Middle East. This is limited to this also goes out to areas of Central Asia and also Southeast Asia and also areas of throughout Africa. So it's not exactly limited, and it's even gone into areas of Europe and even some of the areas of the Americas. So it's not exactly a simple fight. This means it would be a long, drawn-out fight, and it would actually be far more deadly. And this is just basically the actual problematic areas of it. Now, if we take the idea of individualism and understand that only go after people who actually represent an actual direct threat, This would be basically people directly on the borders of the United States and directly inside the United States. This would be this would be limiting the actual threats, and it would be very, very simple to deal with. This also deals with people we could also deal with people on an individual basis, because you could have people that essentially leave that movement very, very simply and go to far more moderate Sunni Islam movements that are of no threat. Yet through his ideas with it, you could easily be killing off people who are of moderate Sunni Islam movements that are not going to be doing any threats. And when you start to go into these things, when you start to go in and you start killing people, you could be killing people that are of no threat. And that's what ends up happening. And then you create more people who are going to be far more radical. That's why many people have actually referred to that region specifically as the hornet's nest, because whenever you try to go after it, it's like swatting a hornet's nest. And this is something why it's not as simple. And the more intervention you do, the worse you make it. That's why a lot of people who have more ideas on foreign policy are going to be far more knowledgeable. While you might have some ideas on, people like that might have ideas on foreign policy, they're not going to be that knowledgeable. And this is why when you start going in there and start wanting to make changes, what do you think is going to be coming in there with it? When you start going after these people, when you start killing people, these are individuals. These aren't just basically, you're not just going in and getting rid of a problem. Ideas get rid of problems. That's the only solution. Ideas get rid of problems. You never can get rid of problems by using force. And that's the whole thing with it. This is where his inconsistency comes in. Is he realizes that force never gets rid of problems when it comes down to things on a domestic level, but he's not applying the same principle to foreign policy. He applies it to basically every other area. That he realizes that basically that force has not done a damn thing on, let's say, the war on poverty. He realizes it has not done a damn thing. In fact, it's actually, once they started the war on poverty, it kept it at an even level. But he realizes it never did a damn thing when it came down to poverty, but he doesn't apply the same ideas when it comes down to that. In fact, when we realize that when you actually engage into violence, it actually makes things worse. In fact, we actually have decades upon decades upon decades of research that shows that when you actually engage in this violence, it actually makes things worse. The actual things show that our approach that we actually use when we actually use violent force against areas for getting rid of Marxism actually showed that Marxism has, in many cases, either not died or has or took far longer to die than when we actually use the simple thing of actually spreading ideas. Ideas are the only way to kill these things. And the fact is when you start using violent force, they're going to double down. And this is what happens with it, and it can become far more deadly for people in the United States when you do this. And if you're actually concerned about individuals and stopping the spread of violent Islam, you should actually assume that this is going to make it far worse. And this is where things can get very, very deadly. And an America First policy on foreign policy should actually be looking at America only. And when we start to look at things, we need to understand what type of systems do they have out there with it. What systems do countries have that are based on our system? And frankly, we would only be looking at countries that are actually either former or current properties of ours that have actually maintained it. Now, and this would mean that the only ones that have actually maintained it that are actually former properties is basically the Philippines. The Philippines is the only one in which we would have this. The reason why we should not be allied with Israel is, frankly, they're actually based off the British system, and they're just as messed up as the British system. They do not. They basically have state media, and they do not. They do not embrace anything when it comes down to freedom. And there is no reason that we should actually be involved in the Middle East. If we look at it, there is no resources in the Middle East that beyond that we can get through voluntary trade with any one of these countries. That if we basically said anybody's free to trade with anybody they want to, that can easily be done. And frankly, if this was done, we could actually create less enemies. And this would not be done with any force. And this is also part of foreign policy. And frankly, if we start to look at it, you'll actually see that Iran is the only one actually in the Middle East that actually has something, and actually has multiple things. If we look at Iran and Syria, those are the only two countries with things validly that we would actually have any interest in trading in that are actually directly in the Middle East, along with, we could probably say, Turkey. Those three countries. Everyone else with it, there's nothing necessary that we would need in trade. Everything else could be produced somewhere else. There's nothing else in that region until you go kind of farther away that would that's not even in the Middle East that is actually necessary of what we actually use. And this is something in which needs to be understood, that there's nothing valuable for the United States of our consumption. And beyond any type of internal loyalty that certain individuals might have, that's the only thing that they would have. Using this idea of saying, well, our system is somewhat similar. Well, what does that even mean? If our system is somewhat similar in government, well, our system is, there's plenty of parliamentary systems out there. Frankly, if we look at Venezuela, they have a parliamentary system. They're socialist, but they have a parliamentary system. Much of Israel is actually socialist. Do we say we need to band together with every socialist government out there? Do we need to say that mainland China is a perfect ideal ally? Even though we know that they've committed many different problems with it, and with what they've done with it, and they've had past relationships with Great Britain. Do we need to do everything that's linked to Great Britain? Do we need to do India? Do we need to do Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia lops people's heads off that they don't like. They took one of our journalists and they chopped them up in pieces. Do we need to have relationships with them? I mean, at what point are we basically stretching things out? And what does one nation have that what does one nation's values have that another nation's don't with it? Because you're starting to really stretch things out. And when you find that that you're basically, all you're doing is you're just basically adding on values on top, adding values that you're trying to push on to people, what are you really doing at that point? Because I mean, beyond taking the idea of saying that the Philippines are based on our direct system, their constitution is based directly on our system, and that's what it is. I mean, beyond any other country than that, you're really stretching the actual point. I mean, there is no other country out there. I mean, you could say we could have alliances with countries that border us, such as Mexico and Canada, but beyond that, you can't, or some in the Caribbean. But beyond that, you're really stretching things out beyond that, and it really gets kind of insane. And this is why there's really no valid thing with it, because you're not actually making an argument on foreign policy based on individualism, because the individual should be the one that makes their own moral code. And if you're basically stating that, well, that only applies if you have these ideals, well, what does that matter? if individualism is far more important, and individuals should set their moral code with it, you're basically stating that you're basically discounting that, and you essentially have agreed with no different than what the religious right has, the religious right wing, and some of these people during the progressive era have done with it, saying that they should establish this moral code that everybody should live by, and that basically that no one should drink, no one should do any drugs. Uh, what's that all the stuff that created the war on drugs with it. Meanwhile, some could actually be helpful for medical conditions. That's basically that they should live by a certain thing with it. That only certain ethnicities are proper to actually exist. I mean, at what point are you really kind of doing it? I mean, you've basically crossed the borderline, and you're almost living on the level of where you're crossing into the Nazi Party at that point, and that's the exact opposite of where individualism should be, and that doesn't fit into any type of foreign policy. Then you're basically saying then you're almost going into the idea of let's kill anybody who doesn't look like us, and you're going into and you could take it as far as that. And the fact is this is why you cannot just say, well, they don't have in what we view as this certain level of values. This is not exactly, you should not be having this and using this idea of, and he goes in between this idea of saying that, well, he's atheist, but well, he doesn't like these, what are called, he's fine with these ideas of Christian religions, but not with these Judeo-Christian religions, but not with like Islam or any of the Eastern religions. And I mean, it's this weird cross between being an atheist and being theistic for only a couple of religions. And he tries to do this as well, which is very, very troubling. And this is where he gets into, where I think he gets into another problem with it. I mean, if you're going to be an atheist, you need to basically be it across the board. You can't basically say that certain religions are better than others. If you're going to be an atheist, I mean, there's a difference between being an atheist and agnostic and being a theist. I mean, if you're a theist, you're going to basically side with one religion over another. I mean, that's fine. If you're going to be, you can have your ideas of saying one sect of Christianity is better than another, one sect of Judaism is better than another, or it could be Sikhism or Taoism or Buddhism or whatever, and or Islam, and it doesn't really matter. But obviously stick to that. That's fine. If you're going to be agnostic, obviously understand with it that you're going to basically say, well, that you're going to be sitting in a idea with it, say, well, I'm not 100% sure with it. I don't believe this point with it, but I'm not 100% sure. I'm not going to rule anything out. Is what really agnostics say. And then if you're going to be an atheist, understand with it that you're going to put all platforms of religion on the same pedestal, that you just do not believe in any of them. And if you're going to do this, you need to do this. And the fact is you cannot just all of a sudden say that, well, these ones are better than the other ones. No. If you go with the ideas on Ayn Rand with it, she was an atheist and she felt that all of them were just as bad as the next. While there's room for basically for someone, if they come to an actual realization of coming from objectivism and going into some type of theology, theocracy, after that point with it, there would obviously be room for that under objectivism. But the fact is you cannot basically say that you cannot come to some type of idea that basically certain religion, if you're going to be atheist, is certain religions are good and certain religions aren't. It doesn't fit into that idea. You're essentially defeating your whole argument of just being an atheist alone. because you're giving merit to certain things. You're essentially defeating your whole argument at this point. You're essentially not secular anymore. You're essentially going into this idea of this weird realm of like an atheist Zionism, which is really weird. And it ends up getting into this like really weird mix, and it's not and I don't think it's healthy. And basically what you're trying to do is you're basically, it almost looks like it's trying to defend Israel at all costs, but you don't really have the grounds to do it on an actual moral argument. It's like you want to defend America, but you don't know how to do it. And the fact is, on a foreign policy perspective, you need to understand that there is no, to defend the individuals, the only thing to do is actually look to the Constitution itself, is to understand that the only thing to do is actually look out for the individuals, is to basically protect their rights and basically protect from people that would mean them harm. And if you look at that would mean that no other country gets any protection. Simple as that. There is nothing. There is no reason to say, well, this country has a good value with it, so they would have it. If you look at the statements of our founders, you had Washington, who basically stated, don't go don't go abroad in search of monsters. And you had Jefferson, who basically said we should be friendly with all nations and have alliances with none. It's as simple as that. I mean, there is no actual reason to actually go out fighting radical Islam unless they actually attack us on our shores. If they don't attack us on our shores, there is no legitimate reason. That is not an American foreign policy. Because otherwise, you're just basically taking the idea of taking a liberal foreign policy and trying to kind of twist it to your means to basically kind of like fit into this narrow box to basically say, well, I mean this with it, but I don't really mean this, and it ends up being a very, very schizophrenic foreign policy idea that does not fit into any type of point of view. It's like you're trying to fit into it's like you disagree with the identity perspective with it. It's like you want to get some of the intellectuals from the identity perspective with it, and you want to get some of the intellectuals from the liberal perspective, but you don't want to actually commit to either one. And you can't just all of a sudden go jumping from one to the next. And because that's very, very schizophrenic. And when we go into foreign policy, and frankly, what we saw in Trump's foreign policy was that's exactly what he did. And if we saw the problems with it, that's exactly what the problems were, was that he actually pandered to Israel. He was actually jumping between an identity perspective and actually not only identity perspective, but realist perspective, identity perspective, a realist perspective, and a liberal perspective. He was jumping between all of them. And frankly, that's what you get. You get a very, very erratic foreign policy that doesn't make any sense. You need to commit to something. And you can't just jump around. And this is where I think Yaron Brook doesn't want to basically commit. And he knows if he commits to a liberal foreign policy perspective, that he defeats his whole argument, and he essentially would have to reevaluate where he stands on issues. And he would essentially have to reevaluate everything. He knows that if he actually went to the identity perspective, that he would essentially have to agree and basically crawl through the doggy door in this case, at least on foreign policy, that people like Ron Paul are right, but that it allows for more consistency. Now, maybe Ron Paul is wrong in certain other areas with it, that he can agree, that he can basically state, that I found in certain areas with it, recently with it, on the more minor issues with it. But when it comes down to it, is that, and more issues on ideas of freedom of movement and things like that. But when it comes down to it, is you need to be consistent, and that's the only thing you have. If you're going to, you can't all of a sudden jump all the way around. If you look at a schizophrenic thing with it, what's going to happen with it is, if you're not consistent, you're actually going to get blown apart. And they're going to say, well, if you're not consistent, why am I following you? Because frankly, with it, when it comes down to, like, let's say, like, people like Marx, people like Marx were actually, Karl Marx was actually very consistent. He understood what his movement was for. It was not for an actual anarchist movement of workers owning everything. It was for an actual strong man actually owning all the means of everything and actually divvying up the last little bit of nothing to the people. He understood that that was going to be that from the start. And there was basically just a reformulated version of a monarchy. And that's what it was. And he just understood this from the start, that it was basically serfdom. That's basic serfdom under a monarchy. Just basically all it was you were now just electing your king instead of it being through birthright. And that's basically why you found that with it. Now, if you start making these things of these subjective things that you think that Ayn Rand meant, you're not really being consistent. Because if you realize that individualism is individualism, and that's you have to understand that basically is that it's going to basically mean that if she meant that everyone can actually establish their own ethics and their own moral guidelines, that no one can actually assert them on someone else. This means that everyone across the globe is actually given their own rights to actually do so, and no one can actually assert them as being wrongfully ethical, and that you cannot kill someone just because you don't believe in their ethics. If we had that system with it, essentially in the United States, people would just be you could essentially argue on this idea of individualism that, well, that guy has the wrong ethics, so I'm just going to go kill them. I mean, at what point does this become a basically just where anybody can kill anybody just because they don't believe in your ethics? It becomes essentially an ethical holy war then. And that essentially what essentially is that advocates for? That essentially advocates for this ethical holy war. And then it just brings it down into an individual basis. Now, if you actually respect the ethics of everybody, as individuals, you're not going to get this, that basically your ethics need to be respected just as much as the next person. And I believe that this is basically the point of individualism. And if this is the point, this means that basically that we cannot go into other countries and say, well, your ethics do not matter. And it does not matter if you say, well, this country doesn't believe in property rights. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can steal their property. Even if they believe in some type of collective properties, if you cannot just go into a Marxist country and say, hey, you guys don't believe in property rights, so we're just going to steal your property. Can we just go in all the way into Venezuela and just steal their country? No, that would be completely wrong. This would be unethical because you're stealing what they have. You cannot do that. You cannot go into China and do the same damn thing. This is just something that you can't do. And you need and if you actually have some type of level of morality, you end up realizing that just because you believe in property rights, and if you believe in property rights, you should understand that even if they don't have an individual idea of property rights, that it doesn't matter if you do, you shouldn't with it. And frankly, in Israel, they don't believe in property rights. We know that they don't with it because they're actually stealing people's property in Palestine. They're not accommodating them for any property. We have records of this. They're not even waiting for them to leave their own property. They're actually just bulldozing over it with people inside. We have records of this. We have video of this. And they're basically just doing it. They're basically expropriating property for no money. This doesn't even fit to the standard of eminent domain. And yet we have people standing by this and saying, "Oh, we consider them an ally." Well, the fact is they're not with it. This is their territory. If they want to basically have some type of commune system, it doesn't matter. You cannot go into someone's property and just basically say, "Well, you're living in a commune system. It means that you don't respect private property, so we're just going to take it from you." They're not going to anybody else's territory and stealing it. This is basically where they're stealing, where you have one country stealing everybody else's. Where essentially Israel was established by United Kingdom's theft of Palestinian property. Now, obviously, it brings into a lot of complicated issues currently because of this in foreign policy. So it brings a very, very complicated issue of how to actually solve the issue, because we're talking that another foreign country actually stole someone's land and gave it to other people. And this is something in which happened around, basically, we're talking around 100 years ago. And this is something which is very, very complicated. And because of this is something in which we need to deal with. Now, if we're going to deal with it in a proper way, we need to say that this needs to happen and we need to deal with it, and not just say, well, we're just going to basically say that Israel is right. Well, that's not necessarily dealing it in a proper way. We can't just ignore everything that's going on. And we obviously can't just basically say, well, we're just going to claim that they have some moral authority over everything that they're doing, and that Israel is automatically this righteous country. Because we see that their leader, Netanyahu, has actually been lying for decades about Iran having a nuclear weapon. So can they actually be trusted? They've been using white phosphorus, which is actually truly a chemical weapon, on other nations, and basically causing not only birth defects, but also causing horrible, painful deaths. I mean, are they actually considered to be an actual peaceful nation? There is actually some basic conduct in the way you conduct war, and they don't even follow it. And they've been basically protected by the U.S. from actually prosecution in the UN through the UN, was it the Defense Council, I think it's called. And this is something which they have been able to avoid prosecution and in the international court systems. And if we're going to basically look at it, that this is why when we start to look at his ideas with it, I understand he's from Israel with it, so he's going to have this bias. And we need to look into you need to look into this when a person's going to make these statements, before they make all these statements. Now, is L.A. Leonard Peikoff with it, bringing from Canada with it, that doesn't make much sense. I mean, him backing the same ideas, I do not know where that one comes from. Frankly, with it, it might be that he's really not as much of advocate on the Ayn Rand Institute's ideas with it of individualism. He might just be kind of more of these ideas that, well, he supports more of the Conservative Party platform in Canada, and that he's really what it calls he likes the idea of individualism, but but supports kind of the whole platform of this conservative party in Canada, which is pretty close to like the neocon ideas, but doesn't necessarily want to kind of admit it because and that could be what's actually happening. And while some of these ideas are fine in individualism, you just have to make sure that you're consistent. And foreign policy is a major issue on individualism. And if you're going to say that one person is an individual in the United States, how is one person not an individual in Palestine? How are they not an individual? How are they not able to come up with their own moral ideas? How are they not basically being able to be treated? How is an individual in, let's say, for instance, India not considered as that? That's an Eastern religion, apparently, with it, which they're saying the Eastern religions aren't equal to the ones like the Judeo-Christian religions. Apparently, how are they not considered to be equal? And this is where you start to get your argument start to really break down, and why it can't really hold up, and why you're not going to get as many people supporting it when you do this. And this is where your problem is going to come about. That if you don't back the morality decisions of everyone, you're not going to be able to back it for ones of individuals you agree with. This is where you need to do it with it. You can't just say, well, these are good people, so we're going to back their ideas. We're going to back their rightful ideas for individuality with it. At what point with it? And then at that point with it, you're basically saying individuality is subjective. The moment you make that argument that individualism is subjective, that's where the whole thing starts to fall apart. And you can't allow any type of philosophy start to fall apart, because you're starting to make the argument that that the basis of your argument is subjective. Any type of philosophy that starts to basically make the statements that it's subjective, that's where problems tend to fall apart really bad. And you can't do that, because then you're letting your personal opinions on things start to derail the original ideas. And it's basically then you'd almost have to state that the characters of Ayn Rand's books are essentially the actual ones who are promoted as being good. Essentially, you'd have to say that's now subjective. And you'd have to say that the ideas of objectivism is now subjective. And that starts to really tear apart at the whole thing with it. And it makes you'd have to essentially almost question your whole viewpoint of the whole idea of it. And when you start to do that, you're going to realize that that when you start saying that everything is subjective, you have nothing left. You need to basically come with the idea of an absolute truth. If you do not come with the idea of an absolute truth on these things in a philosophy, you're not going to actually come with something that's going to be verifiable. Basically, you need to state that either individualism is for either everybody is to be a respected individual, or they're not. Basically, you need to treat it as a fine line between Marxism or not Marxism. You need to treat that fine line between. You need to basically make a hard line between it. When you start to make this gray area, this is where things are going to have a huge problem. And when you start making that gray area of saying, well, it doesn't apply to these people. Well, why not? Oh, because their view is like this. Well, what does that matter? If they're do they lose their individual rights just because they don't view the world in the same way. And that's the whole thing with it, is just because you don't view the world in the same way does not should not necessarily make it to where you lose those core values and your core rights. This would be saying that what it called you lose just because you don't just because you believe in collectivism, you should lose the right to life. Is that what it called? Is that proper? No. That's basically saying that what it called, we should kill everyone that does not believe in individualism but believes in collectivism. We should kill everyone. No, that's not proper. They're still an individual with it, but they what it called, they don't believe in individualist ideas that they should lose their right to actually live. And this is the whole point. When you start to dilute your ideas and they say, well, it doesn't apply in this area, basically you need to understand that it needs to apply across the board. If it doesn't apply across the board in every situation, it's not going to fit. It's the one thing why Marxism has taken hold in certain circles is because it's basically foolproof. Not to say that objectivism can't. It's just it needs someone who's willing to actually defend it across the board and say there is no exceptions to the rule. And say that there is basically, if you're saying, well, I believe in this with it, but there's exceptions to the rule. Once you say that, you've killed the argument. And you're putting a huge damper on the movement. And this is what's happening with it. And I think people like that at the top need to be removed or at least they need to be explained, basically told, you're putting a damper on the movement. And unless you change your opinion on these things, sorry, but you need to go. Because the fact is, if you're not going to actually showcase it as the movement is as it is, and it applies across the board. A philosophy doesn't change just because it's a different area, and everybody should be equally applied to that philosophy. I mean, you're talking with it anytime if there's a huge hole in it with it, a philosophy ends up being destroyed because of that, and that's where there's huge holes. I mean, the idea of deontology by Immanuel Kant with it was very, very simple. This did not mean obviously that there's there's certain other issues with Immanuel Kant that are problematic with it, but deontology is very, very simple, and it basically sets up the idea of where you have an obligation for things, and it assumes of life as an actual duty. And if we actually look at this, we actually should assume that if we apply this as an actual duty with it, it would actually be looking across the board with it. Now, there's problems with that for individuals with it, because they would essentially be negated as individual rights, but because they can never make their own free choices, because they'd always have to have some type of duty to be applied to. But when it comes down to it, is that it does not state that one does not have that one's duty is not negated based on what religion they belong to, what race they belong to, what country they belong to. This does not change. It's foolproof when it comes down to it, and this is where the problem exists. And people need to understand this, and this is where you could not refute it on that point. And this is how a philosophy must be debated with it. It does not change based on some arbitrary fact. That if you were to argue on the point of foreign policy on the part of duty, you could actually make a case for any one of the perspectives. Any one of those could be made as a point. But when you're trying to make the idea of individualism with it, the only one you can actually argue for would actually be the identity perspective. You could not argue against someone's individual rights, and you cannot argue anything close to the liberal perspective. Anything which basically says that your ideas are better than theirs is completely illegitimate. If you're trying to create some type of democracy, some type of utopia, that is completely illegitimate. Anything that says your ideas are better than theirs is completely illegitimate. And the reason why, under any type of individual system, is because you're denying their rights as an individual. And it doesn't matter what type of loyalty you have with it. And I'm coming from basically the point of, I have an actual background with this. I have a bachelor's in history. I have a master's in public administration, where I basically tended to focus a lot on foreign policy. And I graduated with honors. So it's not like I don't know what I'm talking about here. This is kind of my wheelhouse. And when it comes down to this, and so I kind of know exactly what I'm talking about here when it comes here, and that when he was making also the statement saying that John Bolton was not a neocon. John Bolton is exactly what a neocon is. A neocon essentially is one who believes in the liberal foreign policy perspective. This is someone who believes they can go into a country and establish a new type of system. Just because he may have wrote things down with it does not necessarily mean that that they're not a neocon. He was within the same types of family group as people like Mike Pompeo. Same type of ideas with it. He fully supported the idea of the invasion of Iraq. This is the man who actually was working with Benjamin Netanyahu to actually push for it. He was pushing for it from the start. He was not one that was timid and saying, well, I don't think it's such a good idea. He actually has not even apologized for it being a bad idea. He's actually doubled down on it. He's basically all in on this whole idea of intervention. And he has not apologized for it, even though we have information saying that it was completely wrong. People who have realize now it was completely erroneous information. Many of those people have basically apologized for their vote and their actions in doing so. He essentially has been one to double down on it. That's how you know he's a neocon. Those are the ones that are actually the ones doing this. These are people who are actually pro-war. That's what a neoconservative, frankly, is. It means new conservative. The new conservative party was essentially the ones they'll vote for any increase in spending, as long as it means for more defense spending, because they actually believe in this idea that came about during the starting in the progressive era of actual enhancing the idea of more military interventionism. And that's exactly what the neoconservatives are. And that's essentially what John Bolton is. He actually believes in this idea of remaking these states. And that's another area where Yaron Brook makes a huge mistake. And I don't know if it's because he has some idea of thinking that Netanyahu is some type of good leader or something. But frankly, what it is basically they just do not have the freedoms. I don't know if it was because uh, he may have been in some type of secluded type of area in the country in which basically they didn't have to deal with the whole problems out there. But frankly, there's actually a caste system out there, and it's been seen that it depends on what religion you are. Even in Judaism, it depends on what type of Judaism you are out there, into what type of care you get in the actual country. And this is something which is a major problem that they've dealt with, and it has been shown that it's been a major issue. And when we actually see it, we can actually see that they've actually had a bunch of corruption, because he's been basically, when it comes down to Netanyahu, we can actually see that he's been guilty of corruption and war crimes. They're not processing him on the war crimes, but they are processing him on corruption. And it's basically been linked to basically trying to strong arm even media that's basically virtually state media, because you essentially have to apply for a license to become a media group. They don't have free press out there. And this is the whole point, that if we're going to say we're linked to them, that's why there's no link. There's really no link. We actually, out here in this country, you can essentially make any type of media system here in the United States, and it's completely different. There is no blockage of media with it. We have an actual First Amendment that says freedom of press, including independent or mainstream, or even like the government even has their own versions of it as well. So there is ways of getting your things with it out there, and you can actually state your own opinion of actually distributing news of any type of way through different social media channels, even through printing on your own of papers and things like this. You can get it out there, and out there you can't do that. It's no different than Venezuela. It's very, very controlled to what you can get out there with it, and it's Venezuela or China. It's very, very hard to get your actual information out there. And this is why when we start to look at it with it, we need to understand that there's no actual thing in foreign policy that actually says that we should be linked with them. And when it comes down to individuals, if you want to look for individuals, the best thing you could do in foreign policy is defend the United States as itself, nothing more. This is why when we start to look at the idea of individualism, the only way you can look for individualism is only to protect the United States as a whole. And when we start to look at this, is the United States needs to be protected as its own country and nothing else. There's no other reason to do this, because you're looking to protect individuals. There's no reason to go out and attack individuals that basically have no threat to the United States. That's the whole point of what our founders were stating with it. The idea to basically throw that all out the door just because maybe you maybe you originally come from another country for some reason, or you think we should be allied with another country. That's completely erroneous. And to basically start subjecting your opinion on a philosophy is completely erroneous as well, because you're starting to basically dilute it. and then you're basically stating that, well, I think it means this. No, it really doesn't. It means what it means. The individual should be the only thing that matters. Embracing some other nation state is completely stupid. You should never embrace another nation state. That's just basically you're just basically stating some some other pointless piece of land is is superior. Why? No, the only thing the United States should be doing is basically is trying to prevent any type of foreign attackers on our land that are actually going to cause any damage. That's it. Pure and simple. Nothing more. And it's really that simple. It doesn't take much of a genius for that. Going out there and trying to attack another country is stupid, because you're just basically going into this idea of trying to say, well, individualism only applies when we say it does. And then you're going into this idea of trying to basically say the same idea that we've applied the immigration debate, that, well, these people can come in, but those people can't. Well, for what reason? I mean, what makes these people better than those people? Or you can hire Americans, but you can't hire foreigners when it comes down to a company. What makes why does the company get demanded those statements? That's the same idea. That's the same idea. You're essentially making these things in an art. It's all these arbitrary statements that make no sense. And when you start diluting things, you're just making arbitrary statements, and they are completely illegitimate. And that's why things need to be thrown out when you start making arbitrary statements. I'm basically going to end it right here. We're a little bit above an hour, and bye, everyone.